What if I told you that the history of the world, exactly as you know it today, already has a prophetic timeline described in detail for almost 2,000 years? What if the so-called last 7 years on Earth weren't just an apocalyptic theory, but a specific sequence of events revealed in the book of Revelation, connected to ancient biblical prophecies and signs that many believe are already manifesting? Stop for a moment and imagine the entire planet entering a period of global transformation. Intense crises, moral collapse, wars, religious persecutions, and judgments described with powerful symbols in the final pages of the Bible. Have you ever wondered what the Great Tribulation really means? Or who is the prophesied world leader who would emerge amidst the chaos, promising peace, but establishing absolute control? When we talk about the book of Revelation, many people only think of catastrophes, the end of the world, and frightening images. But the text goes far beyond that. It speaks of seals, trumpets, bowls of wrath, the mark of the beast, the rise of the Antichrist, the persecution of the faithful, and at the same time, divine sovereignty guiding each event within a prophetic purpose. It is not just about destruction, but about the fulfillment of ancient promises that run throughout the biblical narrative. The last 7 years described by scholars of prophecy are considered the most intense period in human history, a time when spiritual and political events intertwine dramatically and inevitably. Throughout the centuries, theologians, scholars, and religious leaders have attempted to understand this prophetic sequence. Some see this period as symbolic, others as literal, but there is a line of interpretation that connects the book of Revelation to the prophecies of the Old Testament and points to a final 7-year cycle divided into 2 distinct halves. The first 3.5 years of apparent stability, and the last 3.5 years known as the Great Tribulation. In this scenario, a global system emerges, a centralized government, and unprecedented economic and religious control. Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a world where buying and selling depended on a specific brand? The fascination with the apocalypse stems not only from fear, but from the feeling that it describes something grand and decisive. The text speaks of judgment, but also of revelation. It speaks of collapse, but also of divine intervention. The narrative does not begin with absolute chaos. It unfolds gradually, as if the world were being led step by step to an inevitable breaking point. Wars, rumors of wars, financial crises, natural disasters, and social transformations are frequently associated with signs of the end times. But are we truly understanding what these signs represent within the prophetic framework of the last 7 years? Perhaps you've already heard about the Battle of Armageddon, about the beast that emerges from the sea, about the false prophet who deceives multitudes, and about the triumphant return of Christ. But what happens before that? How are these events organized within a prophetic timeline? Is there an order? Is there a starting point that begins this final countdown? And more importantly, what is humanity's role in this scenario described with such intensity in the scriptures? Today, we're going to delve deeply into the explanation of the last 7 years on Earth according to the book of Revelation, understanding each stage, each symbol, and each event within this prophetic narrative that continues to intrigue millions of people around the world. But before we move on to the more specific details, there's a crucial point that needs to be understood for everything to make sense within this prophetic timeline. Because without understanding the prophetic basis that underpins these events, everything else can seem like just a sequence of disconnected symbolic images. And that's exactly where many people get lost. The book of Revelation was not written to confuse, but to reveal. The very word apocalypse means revelation. There is an order, there is a structure, there is a timeline that needs to be understood with attention, spiritual discernment, and careful reading. When you begin to see the connection between prophecy, history, and the events described, everything gains a new level of depth. Understanding the last 7 years on earth is not just an eschatological curiosity. It's about understanding the climax of the biblical narrative. It's about realizing how the rise of a world leader, the global system, the mark of the beast, the judgments of the seals and trumpets are not random events, but parts of a carefully described scenario. When you understand this, you stop looking at Revelation with fear and begin to see purpose, direction, and sovereignty. That's why it's so important to follow each part of this explanation with complete attention. No, because each detail connects to the next like pieces of a great prophetic puzzle. If you truly want to understand what the book of Revelation teaches about the last 7 years, I need to know that you're here not just watching, but seeking understanding. So tell me in the comments, do you believe these events are literal or symbolic? Write the word prophecy if you want to understand every detail of this timeline, or write Revelation if you want to delve even deeper into this biblical study. I read the comments and they guide the future content I bring to the channel. If this topic resonates with you, if this explanation has already begun to open your mind to a clearer understanding of the Great Tribulation, the Antichrist, the final judgment, and the return of Christ, then please like this video now, because it shows that this type of content needs to continue being produced. Your support allows more people to access this in-depth study of the last 7 years on earth, as described in the book of Revelation. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts, because we're still going to delve into the detailed timeline, the milestone that begins this prophetic period, and the exact division between the first 3.5 years and the Great Tribulation. From here on, in each step will be essential for you to understand what is truly described in the Scriptures, and what may be closer than many imagine. Imagine the world exactly as it is now. Lights on in big cities, crowded airports, functioning markets, children going to school, families planning for the future, people discussing politics, economics, technology, spiritual life. Everything seems to be following its normal course. But, almost imperceptibly, something begins to move behind the scenes of history. It's not an isolated event, not a sudden catastrophe, but a prophetic mechanism beginning to turn. It is at this point that the central question arises. What are the so-called last 7 years, really? And where does this idea that so many associate with the end times and the book of Revelation come from? To understand this prophetic period, we need to go back many centuries before the writing of Revelation to the ancient prophecy recorded in the book of Daniel, especially in chapter 9. There we find the famous prophecy of the 70 weeks. At first glance, it may seem like just a symbolic text, but many scholars of biblical eschatology understand that these weeks do not represent ordinary 7-day weeks, but rather prophetic periods of 7 years each. Within this interpretation, 69 of these weeks would have already been historically fulfilled, leaving one last prophetic week. And it is precisely this last week, composed of 7 years, that many identify as the final period before the full establishment of the kingdom of God. Understand the depth of this. The idea of the last 7 years doesn't originate directly in the book of Revelation. It begins in Daniel, within a context of promise, restoration, and fulfillment. This last week would be a specific time determined for the people and for history, a period of final adjustment, judgment, and also transition. And when we move on to the book of Revelation, we find detailed descriptions of events that seem to fit perfectly within this prophetic 7-year window. Seals being opened, trumpets sounding, global systems consolidating, spiritual persecutions intensifying. But note something important. The scenario doesn't begin with absolute destruction. It begins with an appearance of normality. There are agreements, there are promises of stability. There is a sense of resolution to global crises. It is precisely this apparent calm that prepares the ground for the growing tension. Daniel's last prophetic week points to a leader who would forge an alliance for a specific period, and in the middle of that period, a decisive rupture would occur. This internal division of the 7 years helps to organize the timeline that we later see expanded in Revelation. When you understand this connection between Daniel and Revelation, everything begins to make sense. And it's not a chaotic sequence of disconnected symbols, but a prophetic narrative that spans centuries. The last 7 years come to be seen as the climax of a plan gradually revealed in Scripture. This completely changes how you read each chapter, each vision, each symbol. The atmosphere begins to thicken, almost heavy, as if the air were thick with expectation. Nations argue, alliances crumble, economies fluctuate, rumors of wars and humanitarian crises spread rapidly. Whilst ordinary people feel the weight of global instability in their daily lives, realizing that something is wrong, that the world is heading towards a breaking point. It is precisely in this environment of collective fear and desperate search for stability that an apparently extraordinary leader emerges, someone with a firm discourse, a confident posture, and promises of immediate peace. The figure described by many interpreters as the Antichrist fits into this historical moment as the answer the world cries out for. Someone capable of uniting political blocs, resolving old conflicts, and proposing a new global order based on security and prosperity. When we read 2 Thessalonians, we see mention of the man of lawlessness, the one who exalts himself above all that is called God, someone who presents himself as a solution but carries within him a spirit of deception. Then, Morris in Revelation chapter 13, the first beast emerges with impressive authority, receiving power and influence over peoples and nations. The text describes worldwide admiration, almost a collective reverence, as if the entire planet were captivated by this leader's ability to reorganize chaos. At first, everything seems to make sense. Convincing speeches, historic diplomatic agreements, treaties promising stability in the Middle East, especially involving Israel, which for decades has been at the center of international tensions. Many scholars understand that the 7 prophetic years begin precisely with a peace agreement signed with Israel. Imagine the scene. Leaders shaking hands before the cameras, crowds celebrating, headlines announcing a new era. The promise of security sounds like music to the ears of a humanity weary of conflict. This treaty is seen as the great milestone of reconciliation, a watershed moment in modern history. However, in what begins as hope carries a silent shadow. In the middle of this period, the agreement is abruptly broken. What seemed like stability reveals itself to be strategy. The trust built transforms into control, and admiration gives way to fear. This moment represents the dramatic turning point in the prophetic narrative. The one who was hailed as a peacemaker reveals his true nature. Oppression begins to intensify, control mechanisms are implemented, and centralized decisions affect every aspect of daily life. Imagine the scenario unfolding slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The first 3.5 years don't begin with a visible explosion in the sky, but with subtle movements that, when observed in the light of the book of Revelation, reveal a clear pattern of seals being opened and trumpets sounding as spiritual warnings. The first seal points to conquest and power, not necessarily through tanks in the streets, but through influence, fragile agreements, promises of stability that conceal deep tensions. Then, conflicts begin to multiply. Regional wars, territorial disputes, broken alliances. The peace that seemed solid shows cracks, and fear spreads silently among the nations. As events unfold, hunger emerges not only as a food shortage, but also as a collapse of supply chains, runaway inflation, and prices rising daily. The economic crisis ceases to be a distant headline and begins to affect ordinary families. Money loses value, jobs disappear, markets fluctuate as if on the brink of an abyss. Plagues appear, reminding us of human fragility in the face of viruses, diseases, and overwhelmed healthcare systems. Nothing is instantaneous. It is progressive. Each seal opened prepares the ground for the next impact. When the trumpets begin to sound symbolically, nature itself reacts. Natural disasters intensify, extreme weather events, earthquakes, fires, contaminated waters. These are not just isolated phenomena, but a sequence that creates the feeling that all of creation is groaning. Global confidence gradually disappears. Governments try to control the chaos, but the solutions seem temporary. Instability becomes the new normal. The judgment described is not immediate. It is cumulative. It's like a building that begins to crumble from its foundations. First, small cracks, then compromised columns, and until everyone realizes that the system can no longer support its own weight. This period builds an atmosphere of constant tension. People sense that something is wrong, but they can't pinpoint exactly where it all began. And it is precisely this progression that creates the point of no return, a spiral where each event feeds the next, setting the stage for something even deeper and more decisive. Imagine the world waking up in an eerie silence, not because there is no noise, but because hope has been taken from the air. This is where we enter the most intense point of the entire prophetic narrative, what many scholars call the Great Tribulation, the last 3.5 years that shake the very fabric of humanity. If there was tension in the first half, now everything becomes absolute. The system described in Revelation chapter 13 ceases to be merely a theological interpretation and becomes a real mechanism of global control, influence, and domination. The so-called mark of the beast emerges not only as a religious symbol, but as a seal of belonging to the system. It is not only spiritual, it is economic, social, and political. Buying, selling, working, surviving. Everything becomes dependent on explicit submission. Economic control becomes a tool of coercion. Those who do not accept are excluded. Those who resist are persecuted. Global persecution is no longer regional or isolated. It becomes institutionalized. True faith comes at a high cost, and perhaps the highest in human history. And then the second beast appears, known as the false prophet. He does not rule with brute force, but with spiritual persuasion. He convinces the world to worship the first leader, creates signs, promotes a false spirituality that seduces multitudes. It is here that the spiritual and moral collapse intensifies. It is not just a natural crisis. It is not just war. It is not just famine. It is a reversal of values. What is right becomes intolerance. Truth comes to be seen as a threat. Forced worship ceases to be merely ritual and becomes mandatory public loyalty. Meanwhile, the judgments described as the bowls of wrath begin to be poured out. These are not isolated events, but a sequence of impacts that affect seas, rivers, the atmosphere, political structures, and even the emotional stability of the population. The world suffers not only physically, but psychologically. Fear becomes the universal language. Trust disappears. The moral collapse breeds violence, betrayal, and collective despair. Humanity enters its darkest hour. Notice how this phase represents the absolute climax of the prophetic narrative. It's the point where the system's dominance seems invincible, where control is almost total, where faith is tested to the extreme limit. Many scholars point out that these 3.5 years symbolize the maximum intensification of the spiritual confrontation between light and darkness. And it is precisely here that the tension reaches its peak, setting the stage for something even greater to come. The sky seems to tear open before the eyes of the world, not as a metaphor, but as a literal fulfillment of what was announced centuries ago. After all the accumulated tension, after the rise of the beast, the imposition of the system, the persecutions, the progressive judgments, and the global scenario on the verge of collapse, the prophetic text describes the final intervention recorded in the book of Revelation, chapter 19. It is no longer a warning, no longer a seal being opened, no longer a trumpet echoing in the heavens. It is the return of Christ in power and glory, not as the Lamb who was sacrificed, but as the King who comes to establish ultimate justice. Imagine the scene. Nations gathered, armies mobilized. The epicenter of the conflict concentrated in what tradition calls Armageddon, on the final confrontation between organized human rebellion and the divine government that now manifests itself without intermediaries. The beast and the false prophet, central figures in these 7 years of tribulation, do not simply disappear from history. The text states that they are defeated directly, publicly, and undeniably. That which seemed invincible falls in an instant. The system that controlled the economy, politics, and religion is dismantled. The charismatic leader who promised peace and delivered oppression loses all authority before the glorious manifestation of Christ. This is the point where many imagine total destruction, complete annihilation of humanity. But the biblical narrative points to something deeper. It is not the end of the human race. It is the end of a cycle of rebellion. The 7 years do not end in emptiness. They end in transition. The judgment prepares the ground for restoration. Understand the prophetic logic. Everything announced by the prophets converges on this moment. It is not just punishment, it is fulfillment. Each sign, each event, each global tension is part of a larger arc that points to the establishment of divine rule. Christ's reign inaugurates a new phase, a scenario where authority is no longer usurped by corrupt systems, but exercised by the one who, according to prophecy, governs with justice and truth. This completely changes the perspective on the 7 years. They cease to be merely a period of eschatological terror and come to be seen as a bridge between the collapse of the human system and the implementation of the promised kingdom. And here, there is a spiritual impact that goes beyond chronology. The return of Christ is not just a distant future event. It redefines priorities in the present. If the outcome is restoration, then every warning, every call to repentance, and every admonition contained in these chapters takes on real weight. We are not talking about apocalyptic fiction, but about a prophetic line that points to responsibility, vigilance, and hope. Justice will be done. Evil will not have the final word. History does not end in permanent chaos, but in sovereign intervention.